All right, I think we're good to go. Thank you.
Super, good thinking. So we're going to turn our attention to the South American wintering grounds. And so presenting for us will be Mike Hallworth, and then following that will be a brief update from Craig Thompson on one of the areas we think at least some of these birds are wintering. So Mike, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Hey everybody, thank you for putting this on. This is fantastic. I'm going to take you from the breeding grounds to the wintering grounds. Let me get to the punchline about wintering research, and there currently is none. But how we get there and how we prioritize different priority conservation needs, maybe this can help. And so lots of the research I'm going to talk about was kind of lots of people on paper that was brought up a little bit, and how we got there, and how we get into the wintering grounds. So I can get all right. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is migratory connectivity, because that's a big part of the story. Just so we're all on the same page, that's the geographic link between two or more stages of the annual cycle. And it ranges from weak to strong connectivity. Weak connectivity, there's lots of mixing throughout the annual cycle, to strong connectivity where there's defined populations. And what we need to get there is either capture, mark, recapture data, tracking data, isotopes, or genoscape type data. And for the Connecticut Warbler, until recently, we didn't have really any of that. Here are just some graphical depictions of what the different strength of migratory connectivity might look like, from strong connectivity with the rose-breasted grosbeak. These are banding recoveries. There's clear delineations in the populations, down to weak connectivity with the green-winged teal, and there's just constant overlap of populations throughout the annual cycle. And so how we manage for those different scenarios, there's different ways that we can conserve different regions. And here's one particular species where we estimated the strength of connectivity for prothonotary warblers, where we found that breeding prothonotary warblers, almost all of them throughout the breeding grounds, were wintering in the Magdalena River Valley region in Colombia, which here you see it in red. And after this paper came out, there's been some land purchases in this region to help conserve the species. Even though it's weak connectivity, since there's lots of mixing, they're all going to the same region, which makes it nice for conservation. So disproportionate impacts on the non-breeding grounds can have lots of dividends throughout the entire breeding range. So I'm going to bring this kind of full annual cycle approach for Connecticut warblers, and kind of using what Emily McKinnon and collaborators started with the geolocator paper that came out in, I forget what year, but in ecology. We capitalized on those data and added more tracks to get a kind of full annual cycle approach to where Connecticut warblers could potentially be limited. And so the main question that I had was, how does habitat loss and fragmentation throughout the annual cycle contribute to the ongoing population declines that we have been witnessing? And we predicted that the area of greatest loss will experience population declines, whether it's breeding grounds, somewhere during migration, or in the non-breeding season. And that the populations that experience those greatest habitat losses will show the steepest declines. And I'm going to glaze over a lot of the breeding bird survey and delineating natural populations, because everyone else did such a great job of highlighting the declines and what might, where those are happening. So I'm not going to talk much about those, but we did delineate 8 natural populations based on trend estimates and geography of where the breeding bird survey data were collected. We deployed 5 geolocators at 5 different places, from Quebec all the way over to Alberta. And then we used those tracking estimates to derive habitat loss in different regions of the annual cycle. And so here's what the natural populations can look like. Very, very briefly, all of these populations were declining, and with an I estimated at the time, not as sophisticated as Adam had showed us, but roughly a 9% decline per year across the range, with a great deal of uncertainty. And some of the trends were kind of not linear, obviously, and so there's some interesting patterns in there, but across the board they were declining in this analysis. So to estimate migratory connectivity from geolocator data, as some of you probably know, there's a large degree of location uncertainty with these tags. And so instead of using a point estimate, what I did is broke up the potential stopover locations, both the pre-Atlantic stopover locations. We knew that they were stopping over somewhere along the eastern seaboard of the U.S. for quite a while. It turns out they're here for 5 or 6 days in early October before they make the cross down into South America. So what I did is broke up the range into pre-Atlantic stopovers, post-Atlantic stopovers, and then the stationary non-breeding grounds here in the winter. And to accommodate for the uncertainty in the location estimates, I broke each section into 500 by 500 kilometer grid cells. And what I did there is estimated habitat loss and fragmentation, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So we recovered tags from 4 of the 5 places that we deployed them. The areas where you can see all of these colors delineate the natural population. So this is an individual from Saxon Bog that went down into South America. The take home here is that there's weak connectivity because there's lots of mixing in the non-breeding grounds. All the populations we tracked went to similar places in South America, which we're going to talk about here in a second. I'm going to tee up Craig to talk about the issues in the Gran Chaco. But there's lots of uncertainty. They're stopping somewhere on the eastern seaboard and then ending up in South America. There's some credence to where these birds are going to the eastern seaboard. Emily McKinnon had this in her paper, and this is also here just to reiterate that the birds are moving to the east coast of the US and eastern Canada, and then they're departing from there, and they're here in my neck of the woods in early October, spending about 6 days before they make that 2 or 3 day overnight flight into South America. The different colors here, blue is fall and red is spring. But these are eBird reports. So here's kind of the meat of the talk. We're going to get into kind of habitat loss extracted around breeding bird survey routes, and what you're looking at there is the Hansen et al. Data set that's available in Google Earth, and each one of those colors is a year that represents when forest was lost. And it doesn't tell you what the cause of that loss was, but mainly that it was forest and then it turned to non-forest at some point from 2000 to 2018 in this particular figure here. So what I did is I extracted all that forest cover loss in each one of those 500 by 500 kilometer grid cells, and I calculated a bunch of landscape connectivity metrics, which I'll talk about here in just a second, but I use those to quantify kind of habitat loss, I'm going to call it, and that's conversion from forest to something non-forest. And what I did is I used that connectivity results to kind of weight that average loss. So it wasn't just the bird was in this cell, it's what's incorporating all the uncertainty associated with the tags the best way that possible to kind of get at estimates to incorporate that uncertainty throughout the annual cycle. And this figure on the I don't know if it's the left side of your screen, looks at the breeding grounds and then the kind of where they end up in the winter, just to get an idea of kind of what the habitat loss or forest loss picture might look like. We're going to dive into that here in a second. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about the assumptions and limitations, which could lead to some interesting discussion later. But there's limited inference in this in these results because there's very few distinct non-stopover regions that I truncated to kind of before they left the eastern seaboard and then after they crossed over the Atlantic, in part because of the location uncertainty. Clearly they're stopping over before they get there, so there could be issues there, but only the longer stopovers do we have some credence in that they were actually there. I assume that the individuals from the sampling locations, i.e. the natural populations, represent that entire region. That may hold or may not, that still needs to be tested. And then I assume that the locations remain the same. So i.e. migratory connectivity remain the same over the sampling period, which we truncated from 2000 to 2018 when I stopped the analysis. So here's what the kind of habitat loss or habitat alteration across the annual cycle looks like. These figures here, this is on the breeding grounds from 2000. So the change from 2000 in percentages so that we can compare across the different phases of the annual cycle. Here's the lot. Each one of these lines denotes a natural population, which I'll show you again here in the next slide where those are. But there's quite a bit of loss at the pre-Atlantic stopover. This is where there's lots of human population on the eastern seaboard from Massachusetts down to North Carolina-ish. So that's where a lot of the population is on the East Coast. The post-Atlantic stopover is the northern portion of South America and potentially into some of the Caribbean islands. And then the stationary non-breeding season, which is in the Gran Chaco region. And I didn't realize that the map was down here, so you can match up those colors to those different natural populations where they might be going and the loss of those, the habitat. So in the modeling framework, what I did is I used an importance variable, which is kind of an unbiased estimator of the importance of each variable in this particular model that I used. And so along the x-axis here is the breeding grounds, the pre-Atlantic stopover, post-Atlantic stopover, the winter, and then the cumulative habitat loss across the annual cycle. And each one of these bars represents a different natural population that I summarized by. And you can see the effect size of habitat loss on the breeding grounds. Each one of these colors represents one of those natural populations. And the take-home message here is that most of these bars are higher on the breeding grounds than in the wintering grounds or elsewhere in the annual cycle. But there's some caveats that we can talk about in a little while. But the take-home is that the breeding ground habitat loss seems to be one of the largest drivers, and then the stationary non-breeding grounds in South America is a close second. So this is a time lapse of breeding ground or forest loss on the breeding grounds. Each one of those circles that you're looking at here is a 50-kilometer radius around the center of the breeding bird survey routes. And so here's Quebec all the way up into Alberta, BC over here. And then on the right-hand side of your screen is the northern Gran Chaco. So green is forest and red is forest loss. And there's quite a bit of forest loss. The Gran Chaco is a global hotspot for forest loss. We'll talk about in just a second. So the other portion of this talk or this analysis is that I looked at habitat loss, but it might not just be habitat loss on its own. There's lots of things that come with that, and that's habitat fragmentation. And so we looked at a number of metrics, and we decided on the largest patch index, which is a numeric value from 0 to 100, and it measures the kind of the area to edge metric. With 0, if you have a landscape of 0, then your largest patch is small, and if you have a value of 100, then that 500 by 500 kilometer region is a single habitat patch. Looked at the number of forested patches that ranges from 1 to infinity, and it's the number of patches in the landscape, but not necessarily the configuration of those patches. And then looking at the total forest core area, which is the edge of this was 90 meters into the forest, which was 3 grid cells. So the resolution of that forest loss was 30 meters. And we took the sum of all core area habitat that was non-edge for that metric. So the configuration of forest loss, the take home here is that it does matter, and large forested landscapes support more Connecticut warblers. And so this again is variable importance, where 0 it means that the variable is not important at all, and a score of 1 means that every iteration of the model that variable was included. And so for the breeding grounds, we think it's very strong variable for several of the populations. That the largest patch index is very important for Connecticut warbler abundance in the landscape. Not so much for total core area, although on the breeding grounds it was more important than other regions. And the number of habitat patches for the breeding grounds was also more important, but then similarly important on the non-breeding grounds. So it appears that where the impacts are happening are on the breeding grounds, but then secondary impacts are on the non-breeding season, which we'll kind of talk about in a little bit. I'm going to set up Craig here in a second. I'm going to cut this a little short so we can catch up on time. We found that the large forested landscapes support more Connecticut warblers. And these, if you're interested, is the effect size of habitat loss. So habitat loss in the breeding grounds leads to fewer Connecticut warblers on the landscape. Habitat loss, interestingly, leads to more Connecticut warblers in the non-breeding grounds, which is probably has to do with some uncertainty and not very knowledgeable about what they do during the wintering grounds. And the largest patch index had the strongest effect for most of these, where you have more habitat or where Connecticut warblers are, and you have more of them breeding. Okay, so now we can talk. I think hopefully this can spur the discussion when we talk a little bit and set up Craig for the next portion of this talk. The sources of habitat loss across the range in the breeding grounds is typically forestry and wildfire, conversion of forest to agriculture, and peat mining. In some places like the east, it could be blueberry, conversion for blueberry like Bruno had talked about. In the non-breeding grounds, it's largely commodity-driven deforestation and shifting agriculture. And it turns out that the Gran Chaco region is a global biodiversity hotspot and deforestation hotspot. And so here's the big asterisk and caveat on this entire study is that we know that now that they appear to be going to the Gran Chaco region, Bolivia, Paraguay, and northern Argentina. And that the Gran Chaco ecoregion is a global deforestation hotspot with lots of forest being lost. Between 1985 and 2013, it's lost over 20% of its forest. That's, over 140,000 square kilometers that gets converted from forest to agricultural practices. And that deforestation rate has only increased since 2000. What this our study fails to look at is what happened to the Gran Chaco prior to 2000, when a lot of the declines in this region could have been impacting populations across the breeding grounds. But we do know that habitat loss or alteration across their entire range could be leading to observed declines that we're seeing here on the breeding grounds. And what I hope to kind of get at here and to show is that we have a process, even though there's a lot of uncertainty to account for, but we kind of are starting to get a framework for integrating community science through breeding bird surveys or eBird, integrating tracking data, even though it might be limited, it's at least a start, remote sensing and other sorts of kind of computer-based models that we can then integrate to get a kind of full annual cycle component and kind of get an idea where we can assess all the impacts across the entire annual cycle simultaneously. And this was a figure that kind of Ken Rosenberg had shown at a Road to Recovery seminar, that's showing kind of where we need to go for each species, filling knowledge gaps and forming a working group, which I'm really glad that we're doing. Estimating connectivity, we've kind of scratched the surface for Connecticut warblers, and now we can kind of get into the higher tiers to make some conservation actions and prioritize some conservation activities, so we can hopefully bring this species back before it's too late. This research would not be possible without many of you that's kind of on this call and the funding. And I just want to point out, which might be obvious to everybody, but when we conserve Connecticut warblers, we're also conserving lots of other great things as well, pitcher plants and great gray owls and so on and so forth. And this bottom figure is from Saxon Bog, which was very, very wet when I was catching Connecticut warblers here, as opposed to when I was up in Alberta with Aaron, and I barely got my feet wet when I was up there. So it might look very similar, but when you're out there, yeah, it's really amazing to see the different varied habitats that they're in. So thank you, and I hope that I kind of caught us up on time a little bit and kind of spurred some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. Yeah, appreciate you trying to catch us up a little bit. That was great. Any questions for Mike? We have a minute or two.
Mike, it's Aaron. I was actually, now knowing where the Gran Chaco is, one thing I'm noticing with the agriculture patterns there is like they're making these fields that have like strips of forest in between. Is that an actual policy that sort of has been influenced, or do you know what's going on there?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know a ton, although I do know that Craig knows a little bit more, and I'm kind of increasing my knowledge a bit, but that there is some of that delineation, and kind of, I think in part what forests will be left is going to be conserved, because I think there's lots of concessions to change forest, that it's now forest, into agriculture soon. And so I hope that Connecticut warblers use some of those strips, but I don't know.
Yeah, they're a lot wider than anything I've ever seen, but like it's a very interesting pattern. It's fascinating. I've never seen anything like it.
I got a real quick question while we're on this slide, mainly for maybe Mark and Aaron. Do those aspen stands that hold birds, do they ever have ferns, or are they always, are they negatively associated with fern cover?
I'd say negatively associated with fern cover. Like fern cover for us comes with terrain and wet, right? So like that's good Canada warbler habitat, for example, in Alberta would be lots of ferns. So I'd say you virtually never get them with fern.
Same. It's ferns are generally in a wetter environment and not really conducive to what they use around here.
Okay, thank you. All right. Then we're going to move on to our last presentation for the morning before we get a break. And this will be Craig Thompson from Wisconsin DNR, giving us a little bit about this Gran Chaco region we just learned about. And we think at least a good chunk, if not most, of the Connecticut warblers are going there. And Craig, it looks like you're still in the witness protection program. Is that true?
It is true.
Okay, sounds good.
It's a safer way to exist.
So, all right, take it away.
Yeah, so let me back up here. So, okay, I really appreciate the excellent work that Mike is doing and that strong connection that he's demonstrated between breeding grounds and wintering grounds. And of course, the entire paradigm as you guys all know, bird conservation wise is shifting to full annual cycle conservation. We just simply can't conserve these species without having strategies that span hemispheres. So an overview on the Gran Chaco, and there'll be a little bit of repetition here in regard to what Mike presented, but if anything, I hope it serves as some reinforcement. So this is definitely an imperiled biome. It is something that stretches from, why isn't this advancing for me? There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, so you can see the purple smudge that extends from Bolivia down into northern Argentina. That polygon is in fact the second largest biome in South America after the Amazon basin. This is the Gran Chaco region, and it is actually South America's second largest forest. It covers over 1 million square kilometers, 440,000 square miles. It is vast and largely unexplored, although under great threat, as Mike had previously indicated. If you take a look at what's happening closer on the ground, the Chaco can be split basically into two eco-regional subdivisions. There's predominantly dry Chaco, which is a drier forest type, seasonally wet, that occur with a xerophytic understory that occurs over most of the western portion of the Gran Chaco. The eastern Chaco is dominated by the eastern region of the biome is dominated by what's known as humid Chaco, which is a mosaic of palm savannas and gallery forest and emergent wetlands. So it's really quite rich, but it's considerably wetter than the dry Chaco. And of course, you have different species associations depending on what the ecoregional subdivision is from a Chaco standpoint. As Mike had indicated, this is one of the global biodiversity hotspots, and you have high levels of species richness that occur across all taxa, plants, birds, mammals, and on and on. And incidentally, this Gran Chaco is one of the flagship species for conservationists working not only in Paraguay, but also in Argentina in particular. It was a formerly well-distributed species, never common, but now has been designated as endangered simply because of habitat loss. So there's a great deal of effort underway to try to ensure that we can hang on to this species and a bunch of others which are also similarly threatened. Now, when we take into account everything that's happening in terms of the species associations, of course, we've got a number of neotropical migrants in addition to Connecticut Warbler that depend on either wholly or in part on the availability of habitats across the Gran Chaco biome, not the least of which is yellow-billed cuckoo. And in fact, the entire continental population of all of North America's cuckoos, in fact, both eastern and western subspecies, winter in the Gran Chaco. We're just beginning now to get a better handle on what's exactly going on down there as it relates to yellow-billed cuckoos. But suffice it to say that they are entirely dependent on Gran Chaco forests for survival. Similarly, all of North America's nighthawks spent, or a significant portion of them spend some time in the Gran Chaco. This is a bird that is currently under study. We don't fully understand the wintering ecology of the species, but we do know, we're starting to get a better handle on it now, and we do know that the Gran Chaco plays heavily in terms of importance as a habitat type as this bird moves around South America during the non-breeding portion of its annual cycle. There are a host of other species that, again, as I indicated earlier, have some degree of association with the Gran Chaco. Those species that are shown in tan have wintering populations. Those species that are shown in light green, let's call it avocado, are considered to be passage migrants that don't really spend a lot of time in the Gran Chaco, but for which the Gran Chaco still provides important stopover habitat. So, as Mike had indicated, the Gran Chaco is literally a 5-alarm fire. It has one of the highest deforestation rates in the world, and there are a few reasons for that, but suffice it to say it's being driven largely for agriculture. The underlying basis is conversion to agriculture. We're looking at 34,000 hectares a month, 85,000 acres a month. It's a staggering rate of loss, and if anything, it may actually be increasing. This is a very telling air photo of what's gone on in northern Argentina in the Salta and Chaco provinces. You can see in the slide, in the image from December of 2000, that on the far west side of the Salta province, there is some substantial deforestation that has taken place, but by 2019, oh my gosh, it has just leapfrogged to the left toward the Chaco province. And so this is basically permanent forest loss as these areas go into permanent land cover type conversion to intensive agricultural production. So a net loss and an accelerating loss of these really important habitat types. This is what it looks like from a plane, and as was pointed out by Aaron earlier, there are these strips of forest between these fields of soy, and I don't honestly know if this is policy driven or if this just makes sense because this is an arid environment, and this may help cut down on erosion associated with arid conditions and high winds. And so maybe it's a little bit of both. Whether these wooded strips have value or not for migratory birds of any stripe and any native biota, I'm not sure about. There is keen interest in trying to understand that and perhaps work with growers to try to modify them, at least in terms of species composition, perhaps not in terms of actual geometry, to ensure that they are in fact functioning as it relates to helping to sustain native biota. But that's work that's yet to come, but there is interest in pursuing that. So as it relates to what's actually going on the ground, first and foremost, of course, the first prerequisite for getting this land cleared for agriculture is logging, and there is a great deal of logging that goes on for a number of merchantable species, logging both being legal and illegal. In this particular instance, this is a species of tree called a red quebracho that provides a very dense, durable wood. It's highly valued in the commercial market, and it's heavily harvested. It's one of the signature species that actually occurs down in the Chaco, and as such, wholesale removal of old trees. And this is a logging operation that's removing what is considered to be old. In these dry seasonal forests, the trees don't often get very tall, and so these are considered to be old growth trees that are being removed. And once you have an area that's high graded, oftentimes it transitions into extensive cattle pasture. And of course, cattle production in South America is mushrooming, not only in Argentina and Paraguay, but throughout Bolivia and Brazil and Uruguay, and virtually everywhere else for that matter. So it's really having an impact. I think the upside to this is it's not complete clearing and transition to monocultural industrial agriculture. There is some value associated with the trees and shrubs that remain, even though they're being intensively used as pasture. This is the real downside to what happens as soon as the land clearing starts. This is a soybean operation, and you can see standing Chaco forest in the background, but boy, there's not much habitat. There is literally no habitat value left by the time the industrial growers get a hold of it. And this is large scale production that has transformed this region into one of the largest soybean producers in the world, quite literally. So Paraguay and Argentina are among the largest soy exporters in the world, and this is something where they make a lot of money. You guys all know that due to destabilizing grain markets based on the war in the Ukraine and other things, that these kinds of macroeconomic conditions and drivers really help push expansion of agriculture in areas like this. And in fact, South America has seen the largest expansion of agriculture over the past 20 years, more than any other area on the planet. It's really unfortunate because these are among the most biodiverse habitats in the world. And so it's not just relegated to the Chaco in terms of what's going on as far as conversion of land use, but also in the hyper-diverse savanna known as the Cerrado, most of which occurs in Brazil. And they're even starting to nibble away now on the edges of the Pantanal, the world's largest wetland, which is juxtaposed between the Cerrado and the Gran Chaco to the west. On the good side, and there is some happy news here. So in 2022, that is this year, the Fish and Wildlife Service awarded 2 significant grants for work down in the Gran Chaco. First was awarded to Georgetown, and it deals with a conservation research program for birds. Essentially, they're going to be looking at 15 species of birds and doing surveys across pre-designated portions of the Chaco, focusing on IBAs and protected areas to understand bird distribution and relative abundance and density for 15 priority neotropical migrants. They're also going to be looking at resident species as well. But this is really important work because this helps us understand what birds are going where, and ultimately will lead to an identification of which habitats are considered to be most important for certain species. A subcomponent of this effort is taking a very hard look at the behavioral ecology of yellow-billed cuckoos on their wintering grounds and trying to understand, because this bird is so closely tied to Gran Chaco and the status of the Gran Chaco in general, to try to understand what's going on with this bird. It appears that you get mass movements associated with the seasonal rains. And so no cuckoos one day, thousands of cuckoos a few days after the rains. It's supposed to be quite a remarkable phenomena. And at this point, it still appears to be functional, but we don't know for how long. Just anecdotally, we were having a discussion within a small group of organizations working on bird conservation efforts in the Chaco, and the young woman, Callie Stanley, who worked a postdoc at Georgetown, who's actually spearheading this work, said, well, here's my 10-year work plan. And the response from a well-established biologist in Paraguay was, you might want to rethink the timeline. You literally don't have 10 years. It's because much of what is this now won't be here in 10 years from now. So, time to recalibrate, which just underscores the urgency of these efforts. And then BirdLife International also received an NMBCA grant called Building Ecosystem-Based Adaptation in the Chaco. And the thrust of this is really to bolster, buttress, and expand the conservation infrastructure associated with trying to keep these important bird areas, these protected areas, be they national protected areas or privately protected areas, well protected and functionally managed. So it's building the infrastructure to sustain these wild areas and their associated biota long term. And these 2 projects go hand in hand and are closely aligned. So this is the group of partners that have come together in an ad hoc fashion. Things are pretty rapidly gelling and beginning to crystallize in terms of creating a working group between these groups. Now, BirdLife International is on point and working with their BirdLife partners, Yurda Paraguay and Aves Argentina, with important contributions from the Fish and Wildlife Service in Georgetown, and likewise from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. What we're looking at, interestingly, as we're all participating in this breeding range summit today, we're also looking at convening next year, we believe, a wintering range summit for migratory birds, maybe under the banner of yellow-billed cuckoos. We really haven't decided yet, but suffice to say things are moving in that direction. So I think this is very positive as it relates to not only the future of the Connecticut Warbler in this landscape, but all other migratory and resident birds. There are a number of other organizations, with Wildlife Conservation Society, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and World Wildlife Fund, which also have on-the-ground programs. They've been well established. They're working in different different regions across the biome, and have various partners associated with them. And I think our challenge is to stitch all of these disparate but parallel efforts together into one cohesive conservation strategy for the Gran Chaco. And, and so what we want to do is all be pulling the rope in the same direction and ensure that we are collaborating to achieve a sustainable Chaco long-term. And that's it. Thank you. And very exciting to be part of all this today. And thank you to Alexis and Ryan for organizing it. This is a huge step forward for conservation for this species.
Thank you, Craig. That was fantastic. Any questions for Craig? I'm guessing wintering ground stuff will come up in the afternoon for sure, so we'll have a little bit more of a shot, but anybody?
Well, I was just going to ask, in here in Alberta, we call it the green zone, i.e. the stuff that's intended to be used for forestry and not agriculture. How much of the forestry activities in that region are like, you get in, you do the forestry so that you get agriculture versus that you actually would have a sustainable forestry sector. Is there any of that?
It's a great question, Aaron, and I don't know. It's something that, you know, we're kind of all learning as we go. I'm sure people on the ground know that, but
Yeah.
it's a very unregulated environment, and there are lots of, like I said, macroeconomic forces that come into play. And so different things are happening in different countries, which then precipitate resulting actions in other countries. So what happens in Paraguay in terms of cattle ranching influences what's going on in Argentina in terms of soy production and so on. A lot of money moving back and forth, and lots of collaborations within the private sector to try to ramp up agricultural production. How commercial forestry, whether legal or illegal, fits into that is not clear to me, but we're trying to get all that sorted out.
All right, thanks.
Craig, real quick, we got 1 minute left here. Do we know, like, and anybody maybe, Connecticut Warbler, like, where would I see them in the Gran Chaco? I'm trying to, when I think of the Gran Chaco, maybe I'm thinking of these, like, you know, mature trees with a closed canopy and birds chirping all over, and the Connecticut's are in the understory. Like, do we even know which part of the habitat they're using there?
Well, I'm going to defer to Mike on that, but my understanding based on what he has presented is it's the northern region of the Gran Chaco, particularly in Bolivia.
Yeah, so I've kind of scoured the banding records, the few scant records that we have, and talking to some colleagues that have worked in that area. And there's a handful of birds that have been captured in the northern part of in Bolivia. Ken Rosenberg has scoured the literature, and where they have been captured that we know about are right up in that northern Gran Chaco and kind of the Bolivia region, so the humid kind of area of the Gran Chaco.
Okay. All right. Well, like I said, I'm sure we'll be circling back to that this afternoon when we identify some threats and future needs. Well, wow. Incredible morning. Thanks so much for everybody, to everybody for fantastic presentations, staying on track. We only got 15 minutes behind, which in my book is a win. And, you know, I think we still have some good work to come this afternoon. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep our half-hour break. So let's go 30 minutes on the break and then push all the afternoon agenda items back 15 minutes. So we will reconvene at 1 o'clock to discuss research and monitoring needs. I think we can still end around the 3 p.m. Central Time. Somewhere in there, I think we're going to be able to make up some time. So take your half-hour break. You can stay on the Zoom, but you know, shut your video off, mute yourself. We're not disconnecting or anything, and then we'll pop back in here in half an hour. Thank you.